Dr. Anthea Sellis, and I am the ICA Secretary General, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to the DPC ICA webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping points, which should help us keep the webinar running smoothly, because we don't have a lot of time and we got a lot to get through. So, webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the session. If you have any questions about how the recording will be used, please do get in touch either with us, either at DPC or at ICA, and we'll provide any information that you need. Please, if you could keep your microphones on mute unless you are speaking, and do be aware that we may have to disable the audio for some attendees just so that we can reduce the background noise if required. Please also, if you could turn off your videos to preserve bandwidth as well, that would be greatly appreciated. If you have any questions or comments that come up while another colleague is speaking, please, if you could add them to the chat box or use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of the participants list. When using the chat box, please ensure that you address any of the comments or chats to everybody so that it is visible to the moderators and not just the host. A good portion of the webinar will be dedicated to discussion, so we'd like you all to get involved. And if there are any questions or discussion points that we don't manage to get to during this session, we can forward them to our speakers and we'll follow up after the webinar. Please do note that this webinar will be taking place in English. We are able to take questions, however, in the chat box in English or French, but if you would like to submit your question in any other language, we will respond to it, but after the webinar. So I'm going to jump right into the introduction of our different speakers that are joining us here today. So to start off with, we have Margaret Crockett. So Margaret is the ICA's training officer, and she's responsible for face-to-face training and the online learning program for ICA. She's been working within its professional program, and Margaret advises on all aspects of ICA's training and capacity building. She is also a consultant, archivist, and records manager that has been following the developments and advising clients on issues in digital preservation for the last 25 years. We also have joining us today Adrian Brown from the UK Parliamentary Archives, and Adrian is the Director of the Parliamentary Archives, which provides archives and records management service to the UK Parliament. He is an experienced information management professional with expertise in the management of digital and analog collections, and is an internationally recognized authority in the field of digital preservation with a proven track record in the successful implementation of practical and operational services in 3 national cultural memory institutions. He has also authored the award-winning book, Practical Digital Preservation, a how-to guide for any organization of any size. We also have joining us Anna McNally from the University of Westminster. Anna qualified as an archivist in 2004 and has worked with the university since 2009. Her role is split between encouraging staff and students to use collections and cataloging to make the collections more accessible. She is also currently supervising a trainee as part of the UK National Archives Bridging Digital Gap program. Also joining us today is Angelina Takawira from the UN Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals. With a background in management information systems and having worked with the records management and archives management for the UN since 2001, Angeline is now the digital archivist at the Hague branch of the UN's International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals. She works on developing policy, procedures, strategy, as well as the implementation and operation of the institution's digital preservation system. And finally joining us, 3 more people joining us today, Dorothy Val from the University of York as a digital preservation archivist for the University of York's Bothwick Institute. Dorothy's work supports long-term access to university digital holdings. She joined the Borthwick Institute in 2019, having worked previously as a digital archivist at Emory University, at Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Books Library in Atlanta in the USA. Moderating today will be Sarah Middleton, Head of Advocacy and Communication Engagement for the Digital Preservation Coalition. And also joining us in the background is Jenny Mitchum, who's helping us on the tech side. She is the Head of Good Practice and Standards at the DPC. So now I'm going to hand over now to Sarah to take us forward into this discussion.
Thanks, Anthea. And just before we talk to our invited speakers, our panel of digital preservation experts, I thought it might just be useful to introduce what it is that we mean by digital preservation anyway. And I wondered whether it might be useful just to make the comparison with traditional media, because as archivists, I'm sure this will be something that you're very familiar with. So by traditional media, of course, we mean objects which are generally quite robust. They're tangible, we can hold them in our hands, and they're generally independently understandable as long as you speak the language that they're written in. And I think we're quite experienced now in understanding their worth and assigning value to objects like this. Digital information, on the other hand, and objects are ephemeral by their very nature, so they're susceptible to obsolescence as they're entirely dependent on the media they're stored on, the accessibility of their file format, and often require documentation to use and understand them. Managing issues such as rights can also be much more difficult, from protecting copyright to ensuring personal data is protected. They require us to gain new skills to care for them, or for us to work with new groups of colleagues with different skill groups, so IT specialists, for example. But they do bring a whole host of new benefits. So these are just some of them, and some of the reasons why we preserve. So we can achieve legal and regulatory compliance by having a robust, demonstrable audit trail. We can increase efficiency by having the right information available in the right place at the right time. There's greater scope for innovation and reuse of data, and potentially new revenue streams. We can improve health and safety and protect the environment through continuous improvement, enabled by access to product or service data, through further research and innovation, and through greater transparency, auditability, and accountability. We can enable further research by making available existing data, and we can document our cultural heritage, providing a complete record. So having reliable access to digital data underpins many of the other priorities, some of these priorities an organisation might have. So without well-preserved data, none of these things is possible, actually. So we've heard what's, the opportunities, but what is the challenge then? So digital data, images, documents, etc., all have value and create the opportunities that some of which we've just heard about. But this access depends on software, hardware, and people, and those technology and people change, creating barriers to reuse. Therefore, we need to actively manage data to protect and create these opportunities. And this is really what we're referring to when we're talking about digital preservation. It's the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. So what does digital preservation need? Well, it needs three things, essentially. Organisational infrastructure made up of institutional buy-in. For digital preservation to be effective, it needs to be understood across a whole organisation, not just one or two people. And those people, it needs a multidisciplinary team required with skills including information management, research data management, project change management, software development, user engagement, networking, amongst others. And it needs procedures and processes to underpin the practice. It needs technological infrastructure, by which we mean systems and services. But buying one system off the shelf isn't going to fix digital preservation, unfortunately. To maintain good quality and sustainable digital preservation services, it's important to understand the shifting technological landscape, the options available, workflow management, and the people required to support the processes and systems. And resources, of course, it needs resources, it needs financial resources. And this should be sustainable, targeted and long-term funding rather than provided as a one-off or project basis. And I know that's not always easy, but where possible. It also needs human resources. So organisations must be prepared to invest in capacity, training and development to create a competent and appropriately skilled and responsive workforce ready to address the challenges of digital preservation. Overarching all of that, it also needs an enabling policy and regulatory environment, which means a broad understanding of the issue across policymakers, regulators, legislators. They need to understand the importance of digital preservation and the potential impact of inaction on all areas of government, society, health, economy, culture, and the supporting legislation to go with it, because the absence of this creates a barrier which people, procedures and processes can't overcome. So just a quick advert, because the DPC actually helps its members to achieve these things through programmes of advocacy, awareness raising, community engagement, by providing responses to policy consultations. We provide resources on awareness raising and advocacy as well, training on a broad range of areas within digital preservation, capacity building through targeted support, research and information on the state of the art in digital preservation, and access to examples of good practice and information about relevant standards. But how do we do it? So I'm not going to attempt to answer that. I'm going to hand over to the experts for that, who are going to tell us a bit more about their experiences, perhaps what made them a bit nervous about embarking on the digital preservation journey before they did, and some of the most important things they've learned about digital preservation along the way. So, and all that before we turn to your questions as well. So, Margaret, can I ask you just to turn your webcam back on and give a brief introduction, a bit about your experiences?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. At the moment, my screen is telling me there are 261 in the room together. This is an amazing turnout, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. To kind of give you an answer to some of those questions from my perspective, I would say that unlike the rest of the panel, I'm a bit different because I'm not a practitioner in digital preservation. I'm more of an advisor and a trainer and somebody who very much keeps monitoring what's going on. I came into it partly because I was just interested, and also because I do a lot of current records management, and you can't do that without being aware of the challenges of managing digital information, and then you stumble very quickly upon the issues of preservation and accessibility that have to do with long-term digital preservation. What I would say, and it still really makes me most nervous about digital preservation, is my technology skills. And I use the word technology rather than technical, because I know I have technical skills. I have technical skills from my archives and records management background, but it's really the IT side of things and being able to understand what the issues are from the IT perspective. The most important thing I've learned, I would say, is that you have to do something to preserve digital information, even if you don't think you're going to be keeping it for very long. I think just leaving it is not an option, burying your head in the sand. But I also think that in the ICA, we have a lot of our members who come from low resource environments, either because they live in parts of the world where money is an issue, skills and training in digital preservation are an issue, things like bandwidth can be an issue. But also I work as a consultant with a lot of people in the UK who their organisations are not very wealthy, but you can take some measures to ensure that when you get the resources that you need for perhaps the ideal fix, your information and your records are ready for that longer preservation journey. So things like identifying what it is that you want to keep and ring fencing it in some way is a little step forward, I would say.
Wonderful, thanks Margaret. I was looking for my unmute button there. That's great stuff. We'll move quickly on to Adrian if we can. Adrian, do you have some pearls of wisdom to share?
Well, hello everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to have so many people from all around the world joining us. It's fantastic. And just to say thank you very much to the ICA and the DPC for inviting me to be part of this today. Those of you who may be Star Wars fans may notice I'm joining you from the Jedi Archive, which, as everyone knows, is of course what all digital archives really look like. I'd just like to say a few words about my own sort of journey into getting involved in digital preservation. I'd love to say that I had a master plan which led me to this, but in fact I kind of fell into it through accident. I started life as an archaeologist. In times of unemployment, I did some voluntary work at a local archive. And so when a job was advertised with English Heritage, which is the body responsible for the archaeological and built heritage in England, a job was advertised asking for someone with experience of archives and archaeology. It felt like fate. And that led me into my first permanent role, where I was responsible for looking after the archives produced from archaeological fieldwork. Archaeologists are enthusiastic users of IT, and so I rapidly became interested in the question of how to preserve the digital records which archaeology was producing. Now, at this point, this was the sort of late 1990s, I guess, at which point digital preservation wasn't really established as a discipline or as a subject that one could, for example, study. To any great extent, it was very much a new area for everyone. And so it was a real sort of step into the unknown for me and for others working in the field at the time. So I guess alongside nervousness, I suppose the overriding feeling I had at the time was actually of excitement, because I think what fascinated me and drew me to it was the opportunity to get involved in a subject which we didn't know the answers to. We didn't know how to do this, and the opportunity to actually really get involved in figuring out how to address some of these problems and some of these fascinating challenges. But I guess the sort of the thing that perhaps makes me most nervous throughout my career is really how do we actually address some of these issues in practice? How do we make sure that we can actually carry out effective digital preservation in reality within our own organisations? And then finally, just on the point of perhaps the most important thing I've learned, I would say, firstly, well, collaboration, the importance of collaboration. I have benefited through the whole of my career by working with a huge range of people, sharing ideas and sharing experiences. And one thing I know is that we all progress and move forward through that collaboration, certainly not through trying to solve everything on our own. And just sort of allied to that, the second point I would just make is, I think that it is really essential to keep focused on the, if you like, the practical challenges and the practical solutions to how we deliver successful digital preservation. It's very easy, I think, to get drawn into theoretical sort of debates about some of the finer points of this, and to slightly lose focus from the realities of how we actually ensure that our valuable digital resources can be preserved and remain accessible for the long term. So I think always trying to focus on the practicalities of what we need to do today and to prepare for the future would be my key message. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to the rest of the session with you.
Thanks, Adrian. I know some of the questions we've got coming up do focus on some of those more practical and specific questions, so perhaps we can talk a bit more about that in just a minute. But first, Anna, are you there? Could you turn your webcam on and just say a little bit about your own experiences?
Hello, konnichiwa, guten Tag. My name's Anna. I'm the Senior Archivist at the University of Westminster. We've been involved in digital preservation for around about 5 years. And one thing I would say is that when we started talking about this webinar and Sarah described us all as experts, that made me feel very nervous. So I think one of the things you need to sort of understand is if you're feeling nervous, that's absolutely fine. Even 5 years into this, we still don't consider ourselves experts, and I'm not sure that I ever will do. Digital preservation is really something that's evolved out of our work with the institutional archive. So people just started giving us things in digital form and we really had to deal with them. And that started out, first of all, as a secure server where we could put things on, and then moving into external storage and using Archivematica. But for us, really, the focus the whole way through has been on sort of access and dissemination and enabling staff to retrieve those files, because what we found was happening early on was that staff would give things to us, we would put them on a secure server, they weren't able to access them, so they would then keep their own copies, and then they would edit those copies, and then they would give them back to us again 3 or 4 years later. And we found that there were multiple copies of things going around. So we've always really focused very much on the access as much as on the preservation, and that's really been sort of one of our strategies. For us also, it's very important that we don't just have one member of the team working on this. So I'm not a digital archivist, and we don't have a digital archivist in our team. We're a team of 5, but everyone has this as part of their role. So we don't have a single point of failure, and if one person leaves, the rest of the team will still be able to carry on with it. The other thing that sort of I think I've learned most of all through this is that, as I say, you're not going to be an expert at the start, and you're not going to feel like an expert 5 years later. And it's very much an iterative process. So we had a very short test phase, and we started sort of getting involved with digital preservation really sort of early on. We just wanted to get going with things. And it means that some decisions we made then, we're now revisiting now, but that's absolutely fine. And just accepting that you're going to learn as you go along. And that's, you know, that's really very much part of the process.
Wonderful, thanks, Anna. Angeline, are you there? Could you give us a few words about your experience?
I am here. Thanks, Sarah, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this interesting conversation in which I am totally interested, a total geek. As you already heard from Anthea, I worked in records management in the UN for many years and was only appointed digital archivist in the Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals in 2013. And for those who don't know much about the background of the mechanism, it was only a year old when I was appointed, because this institution was established in 2012 as the successor of the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And it had the mandate to preserve and provide access to the archives of the tribunals, of the 2 predecessor tribunals. So anyway, there I was, digital archivist in the mechanism in 2013, a year-old institution. I had quite a lot of theoretical knowledge about digital preservation, but no practical experience, having worked solely in records management. I did have and do have some background in information systems, so a little bit of technological background there, but I was quite nervous coming into this new role and not being sure about how we would know whether we were doing digital preservation right. So it's a new organization, it's a new team, and very little experience in the practice of digital preservation. A huge volume of digital archives to be preserved, approximately 3 petabytes, in a wide variety of formats. And where would we start? And how would we know that we were not making a mess of things? That was really my personal kind of issue at the time. So anyway, 7 years in, that's now, the most important thing that I have learned is that digital preservation is a community effort. It goes back to what Adrian said. There's a huge community with so much opportunity for sharing, benchmarking, validating your processes, procedures, and strategies and decisions. So you don't really have to have it all figured out in order to start. There's a community out there. And also another important thing is that it's not an all or nothing affair. So you don't have to have a Rolls Royce in order to start, the Rolls Royce of digital preservation. There are levels, and depending on your circumstances, your resources, and so on, the budgets available to you, you can do digital preservation that is within your budget and fits your circumstances, and it will still be good enough. So I would say those are my 2 key lessons at this stage. I know there's a lot more to come. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
I think we'll come back to you on some of those. Thanks, Angelina. And Dorothy, finally, can we, not finally, because we've still got lots more questions to ask, but Dorothy, are you there?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to join you all. I will quickly sort of give some background about how I ended up working in digital preservation. First, I'm really not someone who ever imagined myself working in digital preservation. I was really interested in thinking about the book as an artifact when I was studying English literature. And I initially decided that I would enroll in a library science program in order to pursue a career in rare book librarianship. And once I arrived at library school, my interests began to shift towards digital archives. I think because I read an article about the Salman Rushdie archives at Emory University, and I was really fascinated by all of the implications that the acquisition of digital objects were having upon the way that we approach archival work. And I was particularly interested in the impact of the digital medium upon the creative process and how archivists were kind of working to capture that trace. So I was lucky enough after graduating from library school to get a position at the newly formed Digital Archives Unit at Emory University, which was really established off the back of the Salman Rushdie project and intended to kind of programmatize, if that's a word, digital archives at Emory. I was the digital archivist at Emory University, and I was there until last year. And then last year I joined the University of York as their digital preservation archivist. And so I've always worked in university settings. I think it's really interesting that universities often either have a digital preservation librarian or they have a digital preservation archivist. And I'm always really interested in what leads an institution to choose to have one over the other and what the implications on a digital preservation program might be. Throughout my career, I think it's fair to say that I've approached my work in digital preservation very much through the lens of an archivist. I've always been situated within the archives, and it's as an archivist that I've kind of ended up working in digital preservation. And I think that lots of the principles that underpin archives, thinking about authenticity and integrity and the history of an object and the physicality of an object, they also underpin digital preservation. So there's some very natural overlap between the two fields, and a good deal, I think, that they can learn from one another. Sorry, that's my 2-year-old in the background. Who I think might be coming to join us. Okay, do you want to? Oh, we can't build a tent right now. He wants to build a tent. Sorry. So one of the questions that we were asked was to talk about what made us nervous about digital preservation before we started, and it's a tricky question for me to answer because it sort of implies that there was a defined start point that I was aware of, and I think I'm not sure that that's sort of applied in my case. I think this comes back to what I was saying about coming at this as an archivist first and foremost. I think it was always, I always approached this work as an archivist, and it was only sort of later that I more sort of formally recognised the work that I was doing as being digital preservation, which probably sounds a little bit silly, but there we are. And I think digital preservation has always been central to my work as a digital archivist, but it's only since I arrived at York that it's been officially called out in my job title. So I was digital archivist at Emory, and now at York I'm the digital preservation archivist. And I had a slightly panicky moment, or I've had multiple slightly panicky moments probably, where the addition of that one word has kind of loomed large for me and sent me down this kind of rabbit hole of trying to untangle the two concepts and worrying that maybe I don't know about digital preservation. I'm just an archivist who does digital things. And so I think occasionally I've fallen prey to this idea that there are these kind of bona fide digital preservationists out there who know all the answers and have all the secrets, and I'm not one of them. I'm just an archivist who does digital preservation work. We'll do it in a minute. Hang on, darling. So I think that's been something that has made me nervous in the past, is that idea that there are kind of these real digital preservationists out there and I'm not one of them. But I think what I've come to realize is that there's really no such thing as a sort of digital preservationist, but rather there's this community of people who engage in digital preservation activity as part of their work. And for some people that might be a very significant part of that work, and for some people less so. But I think that's been a really helpful distinction for me, sort of recognizing digital preservation as a collection of principles and tools and processes that I can select from and incorporate and combine and build upon, rather than thinking of digital preservation as this sort of monolithic specialism that you either understand or you don't, or you're either doing or you're not doing. So that's probably been one of the things that I've kind of learned, I would say, in my time doing digital preservation. And I think one other thing that I just wanted to mention was something that Jess White and colleagues at the University of Toronto have talked about, which is that digital preservation exists on a spectrum. It's not a sort of binary state where you're either preserving something or you're not. And this idea is always at the front of my mind, alongside the recognition that our work is constrained by what resources we have available to us, and we can't preserve everything, we shouldn't preserve everything. I think archivists are really good at recognizing that some loss is inevitable, and that preservation is all about managing risk and making decisions based on what resources are available, and then sort of moving up or down this spectrum accordingly. And I think that realization's been really impactful for me, because I think when I first started out, I would hear this term best practice, and that was always my goal, like what is best practice and how do we get there? And now I think I really kind of challenge that idea, the idea that there's something that is best practice, which comes back to this idea that digital preservation really doesn't exist as this kind of monolithic approach. It's not something that you either do or you don't, but rather it's kind of a careful balance of resources and risk in order to move that slider to the place where you're doing enough, which has always been the big question for me, I think, when I'm thinking about how I should approach a particular set of records or type of data. It's at what point am I doing enough to satisfy what's needed here? We don't need to be doing everything. We don't need to be meeting best practice standards to the letter. We just need to sort of find that place where we're balancing resources and risk and doing enough. So I feel like that was a bit of a ramble. I'm sorry, and sorry for the noisy toddler. But yes, looking forward to questions.
Great, thanks Dorothy, and to your helper as well. I think one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar was to kind of address that feeling, as you said, that you have to be doing all or nothing, you have to be achieving the gold standard or you're not doing it properly. Which is why we invited you all as our speakers, because you represent kind of a range of different approaches to digital preservation. You've all come at it in different ways. You've all kind of arrived at the same kind of that realization, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think now it's probably a good time to turn it over to you and our attendees to ask some questions. So I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can see the faces of our panel. So panel, would you mind just turning your webcams back on? And we've got, well, first of all, I should say that we had 500 people registered for this webinar and over 100 questions pre-submitted. And I know that there are already sort of tons kind of scrolling through on the chat box. So thank you all very much for taking part and participating and asking your questions. So maybe a good one to start with is from Amaryllis in Brazil, I think, if it's the Amaryllis I'm thinking of, who asks about convincing stakeholders to invest in digital preservation. She says it seems impossible, and do you have any ideas or top tips to change that? I don't know who to ask first. Anna? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say now is probably a really good time because I imagine most people on this call are working from home and don't have access to their physical collections. And certainly we found that being able to access our digital archives is obviously very useful, both in terms of governance and in terms of teaching. So I think you're thinking about kind of disaster planning, digital archives, obviously that's quite a good way of getting around that. For us, our archive is in the university buildings in the very centre of London, and we were running out of physical space anyway, and it was a lot easier to ask for the money to get some more digital storage than it was for a whole new building. So we've tried to equate it to effectively another a strong room, and sort of rather than, oh, you know, we're doing something new, this is merely an extension of what we're doing and we need this extra space now.
Good thoughts. Anybody else? Adrian, you must have had to make the case for digital preservation several times over in your career.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes. Well, first of all, I would just echo Anna's point. So as we've moved into lockdown here, the one bit of our operations which has carried on pretty much seamlessly has been our digital preservation activities, and particularly the task of ingesting records into our digital repository, which we've been able to carry on pretty much unaffected. So I think I would echo that point, that I think recent circumstances do absolutely highlight the importance. But I think more generally, I guess, risk of sounding slightly obvious, I think one of the key things is to really understand what your stakeholders really care about and what their particular drivers and motivations are, because that will vary enormously in different contexts. So understanding what the people that you have to convince, usually to come up with funding, the kinds of arguments that are most likely to persuade and convince them, I think, is the key thing. And certainly in all of the business cases that I've developed, it's really we very much focused on really trying to understand from the wider organisational point of view how to tie digital preservation into the wider strategic objectives of the organisation, how to demonstrate the value that it brings and the value that it adds. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to focus on the positives as well as as well as the sort of the scare stories about losing our data, because I think you primarily convince organisations if you can show the value that doing this will bring and the future value that it will bring. So yeah, I think that would be the most powerful argument.
Yeah, and actually I should just mention that the DPC members collaborated together to produce a resource that's on the DPC website. It's called the Executive Guide to Digital Preservation, and it's designed to kind of identify those motivators, as you say, Adrian, and creates a set of messages that then you can kind of cut and paste if you like, or tailor them to your own situation. But it talks about the opportunities, it talks in kind of a positive way about digital preservation, as well as the risks as well, if that's going to be what works for your organisation, because it kind of depends. But that's available and is freely open for anybody to use on the DPC website. So thanks both for your thoughts on that. As I said, we've got lots of questions, and of those pre-submitted as well, there were lots and lots about making the case for digital preservation. So I think what your answers will be helpful to lots of people on the webinar today. I'm going to go back to some of the others that we've got in the chat box, and I wondered about this question from Susanti: how to change the culture from conventional to digital archive? When you have a digital archive, should you keep the conventional archive as well? Angeline, is that something that you can talk about?
Well, maybe not to the same extent that people who have been in the business of managing archives could talk to. So institutions like Parliament, for example, and universities and national archives have been doing this for years. And like I said at the beginning, ours is a fairly new organization established in 2012, and we received materials that had been produced by the predecessor institutions. But our approach at the moment is to preserve both things. So we have a lot of records that were born digital as part of the business of the predecessor institutions, and there is no other way to preserve them except to keep what was produced in its born digital state. And whatever was produced in the more conventional formats, in paper format and so on, we also have preservation of that going on. And we are not making a decision to replace one with the other. I don't know if that answers, but at least that's where we are.
Yeah. That's good perspective. How about you, Dorothy? Is that something you've had to think about?
Yes. I think it's a really good question. I think one of the things that is always interesting to me is that sometimes I think we have a tendency to sort of put digital, born digital materials and kind of traditional archival materials sort of as opposites of each other, or somehow as kind of in conflict with it, sort of either or. And we often hear that term hybrid to describe an archives that includes both. But I always think that, archivists have been managing hybrid collections ever since archives were a thing. We've always been managing different types of formats and thinking about how they sit alongside each other and how we have to vary our approaches in order to accommodate the different formats. And so for me, when we're thinking about digital preservation, that's just a new one, but it's something that archivists have been doing for many years. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna stop talking and turn my microphone off. But yeah, I think certainly we should continue to do both and kind of just see the digital as being kind of another format that we're kind of adding to the list.
Yeah, great. And Margaret, I can see you nodding as well. Are there like any particular skills, common skills, knowledge that archivists need to face digital preservation? This is your area of expertise, I believe.
I think what we need to remember is that the skills that we already have as archivists and records managers, we can draw on, and the techniques that we use. So things like appraisal and understanding how organisations create records and archives and how they're related to each other are extremely important. I mentioned earlier about the technological skills that we might need to develop in ourselves. So I think it's a combination, but I also think a really important skill is being able to communicate and relate and build relationships with our IT colleagues. I think that's something that we need to be able to speak to them. We need to be able to explain to them what our priorities and what our principles are, and we need to listen to them and hear what their challenges are and what they're doing. Because I think it's very unusual to get a combination of all of the kind of archival skills and all of the IT skills in one person. I mean, it does happen, yeah, but I don't think it's totally necessary. I think it's teamwork, and I think it's, the sum of the individuals is greater than I think the individuals added up. I'm not pushing this very well, but I think
no, absolutely. Could I just pause a minute and ask people, if they're not speaking, just to turn their microphones off, because we're getting a bit of background noise. It's a bit difficult to hear our speakers. Thank you very much. I agree, Margaret. I think digital preservation is one of those things that you can't do by yourself. It needs sort of either a range of skills, well, perhaps embodied in one person, but more commonly it's going to be kind of across a team, isn't it? And you talk about IT particularly, and there was a really good guide that we've linked to from the DPC website as well, called How to Talk to IT About Digital Preservation, or words to that effect, by Scott Prater, I think. So recommend a read of that if that's something that people are struggling with. So thank you for that. Let's have a look at some more questions. Gosh, there's so many. I have quite a good question, maybe a commonly occurring question that came in that was pre-submitted by one of the attendees. Maybe one for Anna again. Isn't it just PDFing and saving the PDF? Isn't that what digitalization is?
Oh, that's a provocative question. We obviously try and preserve documents as much as possible in the form in which they were created, because that will really impact on how people use them. So for example, if you have an Excel spreadsheet and you preserve that as a PDF, then you're not going to have the same functionality as part of that document, and it would just be a fundamentally different experience. So you might want to produce things like PDFs as a dissemination tool. But then you really want to make sure that the original type of document is preserved, so that all that, you know, that kind of the rich experience and the metadata is in there. And then there might be ways in the future where we're able to sort of explore those documents in more depth. And sort of some people are using things like digital forensics tools to do humanities-based research now, where they can go into the documents and look at things like edits and revisions. Right now, most of the time, we don't allow people access to the documents in that way, but there may be a safe way of doing that in 5-10 years' time. So it's making sure that the same way you wouldn't digitize a paper document and throw away the paper, you're making sure that the original document type is preserved, even if you're producing a more static one for dissemination.
And that answers actually another question that came in about what to do with the original after you have a digitized version. So the approach is the same, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we've got collections that were digitized in the sort of early 2000s, and all the pass lists of the university throughout the 1970s and right up to early 90s, and they were all scanned and fortunately weren't thrown away, because the scans were done in a proprietary format. The company went out of business, and now for the first few years that I was at the university, there was a standalone computer with the software still on it where you could still access the scans, but now we're back to having to use the paper versions again. So yeah, always keep the paper.
Always keep the original, yeah. Good one. Okay, I wonder if I can ask about authenticity. I've had a question about guaranteeing the authenticity of digital archives and what tools and processes are needed. So Angeline, this must be something that's really quite important in your work.
Sorry, just looking for a minute. Yeah, yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and one in which indeed, as a court, it's one that we are totally engaged with. And authenticity is really ensuring that records are what they purport to be, and it's not only something we're thinking about in terms of in the area of digital preservation, but throughout. So from creation through use and maintenance and storage and transfer between systems and so on, measures have to be in place to guarantee authenticity and integrity of content, so that it's trustworthy, so that it's reliable, and it's not only about tools. So it's about procedures, it's about processes. So for example, one of the things that we have been very careful about is when records are created, they are created in environments where strict access controls are implemented, so that there is no accidental or purposeful but unauthorized change to the records. And when any change is authorized, it must be clearly documented why it's changed, on whose authority, and so on, so that there's a complete chain of custody or digital provenance for the life of that information asset or that record, which keeps that trustworthiness, that reliability intact. And levels, I guess, are also variable. So like what I alluded to earlier, in a court setting, it might also be important to retain a level of experiential authenticity, especially for court exhibits, which may need to be reused in another case. But where those requirements are not there, then the level of the experiential authenticity might not be a necessary requirement for a different circumstance. So, yeah, it's not just tools. I think tools are just part of it. It's processes, it's procedures, it's policies in place that safeguard the records and ensure that they can be trusted and relied upon in the future and for as long as required, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And Adrian, you must have to think about that as parliamentary archives as well, mustn't you?
Sorry, just finding my own mute button too. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think Angeline has covered comprehensively the answer, really. I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that I sometimes think we perhaps get too caught up on the issue of authenticity in a digital context and in seeing it as somehow different. Whereas, of course, the role of archives is to preserve authentic records in all formats. This is what archives do, and in a sense, therefore, I think there's a danger that we overthink authenticity from a digital perspective and forget that we have the skills and techniques to manage this for records in all formats. But I think I wouldn't have anything to add really to the points that Angeline had made about some of the specific measures that we can take in a digital world.
Great stuff. Well, I can't believe it, but we're actually coming up to the end of our webinar already. But I wanted to ask each of you in turn for maybe any advice for people who want to enter the field. Do you have like one top tip or one piece of advice that you could offer anybody interested in working in digital preservation? I'm going to see if I can find you all on my list now and come to you in turn. Adrian, I'll come to you first because you're first on my list.
Thank you. Well, I guess my top tip would be, if you are interested, then go for it. Don't be put off by fears or being anxious or feeling that you don't have the skills. I think so many of us, and myself included, who've come into the role have done so. We haven't come with some great background which has somehow equipped us to do this. We've all, I think, learned along the way, and I think various people have talked about the fact that I think none of us feel like we're experts. We're still very much learning, but I think the most important thing is to get stuck in and try things, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. I've made many mistakes in my career, as I'm sure everyone has done, and that's how we learn. So yeah, just don't be put off and go for it.
Super. One of the other questions was, what are the errors? What's some of the errors that you've made in practicing and trying out digital preservation? But that might be a whole other webinar. I think we will have to come to that one as a follow-up, I think. Margaret, same question to you, but do you have any advice in terms of kind of professional qualifications? Do you need professional qualifications to be a digital archivist working in preservation?
I think I would say yes, a professional qualification. One of the ones that has a really good digital component to it would be the ideal way forward. But I also think we've talked about it being a fast changing world. I think you have to be willing to continuously learn and grow in the field. And I think my advice would be to make sure that you get yourself a network and get linked into the community, as everyone who is here today is obviously doing, and read what you can, and just be prepared that it's almost a lifetime commitment, really. If you want to carry on in archives, you can't ignore the digital, even if you think your future is in medieval manuscripts.
Good one. Thanks. Anna, how about you? What do you think? What's your advice for getting into digital preservation as a career?
I think it's just really being open to it. As you know, I mean, obviously everyone on this call has come on because they're interested, but I think there's a remarkable number of people, unfortunately, in the archives profession who are kind of hoping that if they ignore it, it might go away, and it's not going to. So I think there's obviously the DPC has just done the training course with National Archives and obviously the know-how one. I think that's a really good opportunity for people to start learning. And yeah, just really kind of go out there and start reading blogs, start following the conversations on Twitter, and you gradually will just pick things up. Once you know the kind of basic terminology, it won't seem so terrifying anymore.
Super, thank you. Dorothy, do you have a top tip? What's the one thing you would advise people to do to get started in digital preservation?
I mean, I would echo everything that everyone's said so far. The one thing I might add maybe is to sort of start out by setting yourself a small goal. I think digital preservation can seem really intimidating, and like there's just so much that you need to get figured out that it's just impossible. But it's a really good idea, I think, to just sort of, and something that's always worked for me is to just identify a small goal that might be something that you've pulled from one of the tools like DPC's RAM, or it could be to work with like a particular collection that you have, and just set yourself a small goal of completing that one thing, and then build on that. Don't try to do everything all at once, because that can be really disheartening.
Good one. And Angelina, are there any resources or any tools, maybe open source or free resources that you could point people to that might help them get started, particularly thinking about those archives who might have very little in the way of resources?
And I would like to agree with everything that everyone said about how to start digital preservation. I think the barriers to entry are not that high, because it seems everybody holds back because they think, wow, we just don't have capacity, capability, we don't have money, we don't have all kinds of other barriers that stop progress. But there are resources. So the DPC is an absolute rich source of all kinds of content, covering a range of areas within the digital preservation practice and theory. And there's also a lot of open source tools that are freely available. And one of the things that a person can do at a basic level, and it is digital preservation, is making many copies, because it's an approach to preservation. Multiple copies keep things safe. So if you are doing that, you are actually doing a component of digital preservation. But if you want to know a little bit more about your content, so what are you keeping instead of just stuff on some storage? Then there are tools like Droid that allow you to know a little bit more about your content. So what formats are there? Are they valid? Are they properly formed, and so on? And then you get deeper into the practice of digital preservation, and it progresses that way. So yeah, the DPC website is my one recommendation for a range of materials. And get started with tools such as Droid, which are freely and openly available. And baby steps, and before you know it, it becomes part of what you are able to do and can speak to.
Super. Thanks, Angeline. That's really great. Some really good tips from you all there. So, as I said, we've had just hundreds of questions, and they've been pouring in as we've been talking and listening to our panel as well. So I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to answer them all. And I think what we'll do is I'll circulate the rest of the questions to the panel, and we'll see if we can put together a follow-up blog post with some questions and answers and pointers to some other resources as well. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Adrian, to Angeline, to Margaret, to Anna, to Dorothy, and to Anthea for inviting us to have this webinar with you today. So Anthea, thanks, back to you.
Well, thank you very much to the DPC for agreeing to co-host with us. I think it's been a great webinar, and I think we've had some really interesting conversations and many more moving forward. But I would like to thank everybody for attending today. For information, the recording of the webinar will be shared by the DPC and the ICA at the latest by the end of this week, but hopefully by tomorrow. Please do also read the blog posts we've posted throughout the day today on various topics within and around digital preservation. So that's available on the ICA blog. If you would like to find out more about the DPC, do visit their website at www.dpconline.org. Also, if you want to hear or learn more about ICA, please go to our website, www.ica.org. You can follow both the organizations on Twitter. So DPC is at DPC_chat and ICA is at ICArchive. So you can just look us up. I'm sure you'll be able to find us on Twitter. And you can email either Sarah, whose email is up there now, or you can also email us at ica@ica.org. So thank you again to our speakers, to DPC, and to everybody who joined us here today. And we will see you next time. Have a great day, night, or afternoon.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.